January 1945. The chill of winter lingers over the frozen landscape of Western Europe. Snow blankets the fields. The crunch of boots on ice breaks the otherwise still air. Along the riverbanks, weary German soldiers keep a watchful eye, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. The rivers are their defense. The Meuse, the Rhine, impassable barriers that should keep the Allies at bay. But then, a rumble. Low at first, then rising steadily. A deep mechanical hum growing louder, closer. Through the mist and the fog, a shape emerges. Slowly at first, then with surprising speed. A tank, its large hull cutting through the frigid water. No bridge, no ferry, just the tank, its tracks biting into the riverbed, crossing as if the water was nothing more than mud. For the German soldiers on the banks, disbelief quickly turns to confusion and fear. This was impossible. Tanks were not meant to cross rivers. Yet here, before their eyes, the impossible was happening. American Sherman tanks were advancing, not around the water, not over a bridge, but through it. And for the Germans, this wasn't just a tactical surprise. It was a nightmare. The tide of the war had shifted. Not with a barrage of artillery or a sudden blitzkrieg, but with an unexpected innovation that would change everything. The war was no longer confined to the familiar strategies. The Allies were adapting, and in doing so, they were rewriting the rules of battle itself. By the close of 1944, the European theater was in a state of constant flux. The Allies, who had stormed the beaches of Normandy in June, were now advancing deeper into occupied Europe. The D-Day landings had been a turning point, but the task of liberating the continent from Nazi control remained daunting. Despite the steady retreat of German forces, the geography of Europe posed significant challenges, with natural barriers like rivers standing in the way of the Allied push eastward. The Meuse, the Seine, and the mighty Rhine had become the last line of defense for the Germans. These rivers were not just physical obstacles, they were part of a larger, carefully constructed defense strategy. German military planners had positioned their forces along these waterways, reinforcing them with bunkers, anti-tank positions, and infantry. They believed that these rivers would be enough to halt any Allied advance. But by late 1944, the Germans were facing overwhelming pressure. The Soviet Union was pushing from the east, while the Western Allies had established a foothold in France and Belgium. The German war machine was in retreat, and their forces were spread thin. Their position had become increasingly vulnerable. The Allies, however, had an advantage that the Germans could not foresee. The successful landings in Normandy, coupled with the relentless advances across France, had put the Germans on the back foot. The Allies now needed to breach the remaining natural defenses, primarily the rivers. The question was no longer if the Allies would cross these waterways, but how. Traditional methods of river crossings, pontoon bridges, ferries, and temporary fords were too slow, too vulnerable. The Allies needed something faster, something that would catch the Germans off guard. Enter the Sherman tank. This was a new development, a piece of technology that had been designed specifically for the amphibious assault. The M4 Sherman tank, already proven in battle, was transformed with the addition of a floating kit. This was no ordinary tank. The duplex drive tank was equipped with a large canvas screen that allowed it to float. Engineers had to balance the tank's weight and firepower with the need for buoyancy, and the result was a remarkable innovation. It was not perfect, but it was effective. For the Germans, these river crossings were their final line of defense. They could not afford to lose the rivers, yet they had no idea how vulnerable they had become. The Americans were now prepared to launch a new kind of assault, one that would bypass these barriers altogether. And as the Allies set their sights on the German heartland, the Sherman tanks would play a pivotal role in making that possible. As the Allies approached the final stages of their campaign in Western Europe, the introduction of amphibious Sherman tanks was not just a tactical maneuver, it was a paradigm shift in military strategy. The German forces, who had been meticulously preparing their defenses along these rivers, were caught completely off guard by the unexpected use of amphibious tanks. This innovation had multiple layers of impact on the human experience of war: the tactical approaches to battle, the technology used, the leadership decisions that led to the creation of the DD tank, the morale of both sides, and the German perspective on this new threat. For soldiers on both sides, the appearance of Sherman tanks crossing rivers without bridges was a moment of profound disbelief. The German soldiers, many of whom had been stationed along the riverbanks for months, had never anticipated this kind of assault. Tanks were meant to cross roads and fields, not rivers. They were trained to expect a slow and methodical advance from the Allies, who would need to establish pontoon bridges or ferry vehicles across. But when the first DD Sherman tanks appeared, moving across the river like amphibious creatures, it shattered their expectations. For the German infantrymen, it was a blow to their morale. The rivers were supposed to be their final defense. They had watched the Allies slowly advance for months, but the rivers, they thought, would keep them safe. Yet, now, with tanks advancing across the water, it became clear that no geographical feature could stop the Allies. The Germans had to quickly recalibrate their strategies, scrambling to protect bridges and fortifications that were no longer as important as they had believed. On the Allied side, the shock was also evident, but in a different form. The soldiers who witnessed these river crossings were struck by a sense of awe. They knew the technology was experimental, that the tanks might not perform as expected. Yet, seeing them in action, crossing the rivers with ease, felt almost like a miracle. These moments reinforced a shared sense of purpose and confidence. The Allies had not just relied on brute force, they had outsmarted the enemy with innovation. The moment of crossing, once considered insurmountable, now seemed to be within their grasp. From a purely tactical standpoint, the amphibious Sherman tank was a revolutionary asset. In a war where the ability to advance depended on the successful crossing of obstacles, the DD tank gave the Allies a strategic advantage that few could have predicted. The Germans had relied on their river defenses as a cornerstone of their overall strategy. Fortified positions along these waterways, combined with extensive minefields, made the rivers seem insurmountable. But the DD tank, with its floating capabilities, rendered these defenses obsolete. The tactical benefits of the DD tank were immediately apparent. No longer would the Allies need to wait for cumbersome pontoon bridges or ferries to be established. With the ability to send tanks across the river in a matter of minutes, the Allies gained the ability to surprise the Germans at key locations. The rapid advance across the rivers allowed for the establishment of secure beachheads and the immediate deployment of infantry and armor, creating a momentum that the Germans struggled to counter. The tanks were not invulnerable, of course. The DD tanks had their limitations, especially in rough waters and strong currents. The flotation screens could tear, and the tanks would sometimes struggle with resistance from the water. But in many cases, these minor flaws were outweighed by the sheer shock and tactical advantage the tanks provided. The element of surprise alone was enough to turn the tide in many engagements. German forces were forced to constantly adapt to a battlefield where the Allies could strike at any point along the river. The technology behind the DD Sherman tank was a remarkable achievement, a product of innovation born from necessity. The M4 Sherman, already a reliable and versatile tank, had been modified to meet the growing needs of amphibious operations. The addition of the duplex drive system, which consisted of a large canvas screen and propellers, transformed the Sherman into an amphibious vehicle capable of crossing rivers and lakes. While the idea of using tanks in amphibious assaults was not new, the DD tank represented the first true integration of this concept on a large scale. The designers faced numerous challenges, including the tank's weight and the need to maintain its firepower while ensuring it could float. The solution was a simple yet effective one: the flotation screen that surrounded the hull, allowing the tank to float and propel itself across water. This design, however, was not without its flaws. The screens were vulnerable to damage, and the tanks could only operate in relatively calm waters. But despite these challenges, the DD tank proved to be an invaluable tool in the Allied arsenal. The innovation behind the DD Sherman tank had a lasting impact on military technology. It showed how, even in the midst of the horrors of war, human ingenuity could produce solutions that completely altered the nature of conflict. The ability to cross rivers without bridges, to bypass the enemy's strongest defenses, became a precedent for future military engineering. The DD Sherman tank was not just a solution to a specific problem. It was a testament to how military technology could evolve rapidly in response to new challenges. The leadership behind the creation and deployment of the DD Sherman tank was pivotal. The idea of using amphibious tanks was not born overnight. It was the result of years of experimentation and adaptation. The United States, working closely with British engineers, recognized the need for new methods of crossing rivers in the face of increasingly stiff German resistance. But it was the leadership of key military figures, such as General George Patton and others, that pushed the development of the DD tank to the forefront of Allied strategy. Leaders understood the importance of technological superiority in breaking the German defenses. They were willing to embrace untested solutions in order to maintain the momentum of the war effort. Patton, known for his aggressive approach to warfare, was particularly keen on using innovation to surprise the Germans. The DD Sherman tanks were an example of how Allied commanders were thinking beyond conventional tactics. They recognized that the Germans had grown predictable, relying too heavily on static defenses. The DD tanks, by bypassing these defenses, were a direct challenge to the German command structure. These leaders were also keenly aware of the psychological impact that such innovations would have on both their own forces and the enemy. By showcasing their ability to cross rivers with ease, the Allies demonstrated not just technological superiority, but the willingness to adapt to new challenges. The leadership behind the DD Sherman tank showed how flexibility, creativity, and bold decision-making were as critical to victory as firepower and strategy. The introduction of the DD Sherman tank had a significant moral impact on both the Allied and German soldiers. For the Germans, witnessing tanks crossing rivers was a blow to their belief in the invulnerability of their defenses. The Germans had built their entire strategy around the idea that rivers were natural barriers, that they would protect their homeland from the advancing Allies. The appearance of the amphibious tanks shattered this belief and added to the growing sense of hopelessness within the German ranks. The river, once seen as their final line of defense, was no longer an obstacle. On the Allied side, the success of the DD Sherman tank was a morale booster. It demonstrated that, despite the horrors of war, innovation and ingenuity could lead to success. For the soldiers, knowing that their leaders were willing to invest in such technology gave them confidence. It reinforced the idea that they were not just fighting with sheer numbers and firepower, they were fighting with brains as well as brawn. The success of the DD Sherman tanks was a reminder that victory could come not just through strength, but through creativity and adaptability. From the German perspective, the appearance of amphibious tanks crossing the rivers was a nightmare. German soldiers had become accustomed to the static nature of the front lines. They knew that rivers would slow the Allies down, forcing them to establish vulnerable bridgeheads. But when the Americans showed up with floating tanks, it shattered the Germans' sense of security. This tactical surprise forced the Germans to abandon their well-laid plans and scramble for a new defense strategy. The sight of tanks crossing rivers was a psychological blow that echoed throughout the German ranks. Soldiers who had once believed that their defenses were impenetrable now faced an enemy that could defy logic and expectation. The Germans, already stretched thin from fighting on multiple fronts, could not afford to be caught off guard. But with each river crossing, the Allies gained an upper hand, pushing the Germans further back. The true turning point in the use of the amphibious Sherman tank came during the harsh winter of 1944-1945, as the Allies prepared for their next major challenge, crossing the great rivers that marked the natural boundary between them and Nazi Germany. The D-Day landings had successfully breached the Western Front, but the rivers, particularly the Meuse and Rhine, stood as the last formidable obstacles. These rivers were not merely physical barriers. They were symbolic strongholds that the Germans believed would protect them from the encroaching Allied forces. By December 1944, the Allies had already liberated vast areas of France and were pushing into Belgium. But with the Germans still holding their fortified positions along the riverbanks, the Allies needed a breakthrough, a way to bypass these defensive lines without wasting precious time and resources on lengthy, vulnerable crossings. Traditional methods, such as pontoon bridges, were too slow and exposed to enemy fire. The Germans were entrenched along the riverbanks, ready to unleash devastating counterattacks on any crossing. In the face of this challenge, American engineers and military planners decided to press forward with an unorthodox and risky solution. They chose to deploy the newly modified DD Sherman tanks, amphibious vehicles capable of crossing rivers without the need for bridges or ferries. While the DD tanks had been used earlier in limited operations, this would be the first time they would be called upon to play a decisive role in breaking through German defenses on such a large scale. The timing could not have been more critical. As the Battle of the Bulge raged in the Ardennes, the Germans launched a massive counteroffensive in a desperate attempt to divide the Allied lines and capture vital supply routes. The Germans were hoping to catch the Allies off guard. But the Allies, despite being spread thin, had their own surprise in store. The Germans were convinced that their river defenses, fortified positions, minefields, and anti-tank units would provide them with the security they needed. To them, the rivers were insurmountable obstacles that would slow or halt the Allies' momentum. But in a stroke of tactical brilliance, the Allies launched an unexpected amphibious operation. In the critical moment of the Battle of the Bulge, the DD Sherman tanks were unleashed to cross the Meuse River. The tanks, their flotation screens raised, moved across the water as if they were little more than boats, their tracks churning in the frigid currents. The German forces, who had been preparing to repel the Allied advance from the safety of their entrenched positions along the river, could hardly believe their eyes. The shock was immediate. German soldiers, accustomed to a slow-moving, predictable war, watched in stunned silence as the tanks appeared on the other side of the river. The impact was not just tactical, it was psychological. The Germans had built their defenses around the assumption that the rivers would hold back the Allies. The appearance of the amphibious tanks completely shattered this illusion. The river, once seen as a fortress, was now no more than a temporary obstacle. The German commanders scrambled to respond, but by the time they had mobilized their forces, the Allies had already established a foothold. The Sherman tanks, along with the accompanying infantry, secured vital bridgeheads and positions on the opposite bank, effectively bypassing one of the most formidable natural barriers in Europe. The Germans, now reeling from the surprise, had no time to regroup. Their carefully laid defenses along the rivers were no longer relevant. The Allies were already inside their lines. This was a pivotal moment in the battle. The river that had once been a natural fortress had become a pathway for the advancing Allies. It was not just a tactical victory, but a message to the Germans. Their strategic thinking had failed. The Allies were no longer bound by the conventional limitations of warfare. They were now capable of surprising their enemy in ways the Germans could never have anticipated. The psychological blow was perhaps even more significant than the tactical one. For months, the German High Command had relied on the belief that the rivers were impassable to any serious advance. The DD Sherman tanks proved them wrong, and the ripple effect was immediate. German soldiers along the front line began to lose faith in their leadership and their defenses. The realization spread quickly. If the rivers could be crossed, what other barriers could the Allies bypass next? Moreover, the German command, already stretched thin with forces fighting on multiple fronts, was left scrambling to adjust to this new reality. They had believed that the Allied advance would be methodical, predictable, and slow. The tanks crossing the rivers in a matter of hours were a symbol of the relentless pace at which the Allies were advancing. The Germans now understood that the war was slipping away from them, and the Allies had an unstoppable momentum. In a larger sense, the crossing was symbolic of the changing nature of the war itself. The Allies were no longer fighting a conventional war of attrition. They were adapting faster than the Germans could react. The Germans, whose military doctrine had once been defined by quick strikes and technological superiority, now found themselves outmatched in both speed and innovation. This was not just a war of tanks, guns, and men. It was a war of ideas. And in this moment, the Allies had proven that their ideas, bolstered by technological innovation and a willingness to take risks, could overcome even the most entrenched defenses. As the tanks crossed the river, the world shifted. No longer was the outcome of the war inevitable in the minds of the German soldiers and commanders. What had seemed like an insurmountable obstacle had been easily overcome. And as the Allies continued to press forward, the Germans realized that the writing was on the wall. The war was ending, and it was the Allies, with their ingenuity and will to adapt, who were pushing it toward its inevitable conclusion. The immediate aftermath of the amphibious Sherman tank river crossings was a decisive moment in the final stages of the war. The success of these river crossings marked a critical shift in the balance of power. The Allies, having proven that no barrier, whether natural or man-made, could halt their advance, began to push even further into Germany's heartland with renewed vigor. For the German forces, the once impregnable river defenses that had protected their homeland for so long were shattered in a matter of hours. The river, which had been a symbol of security, was now just another battlefield to be crossed. The Germans were left reeling. Their meticulously planned defense strategy, which had hinged on the assumption that the rivers would provide an effective deterrent, was utterly defied by the amphibious Sherman tanks. The Allies had bypassed the rivers entirely, making the German defensive positions irrelevant. What had seemed like a secure front line, one that the Germans had poured so many resources into, was now a point of vulnerability. German command had not been prepared for this kind of assault. The shock was immediate and deep. Riverbanks that had been fortified with bunkers, anti-tank positions, and minefields were now left exposed. The German troops who had been stationed along these rivers, certain in the safety they provided, now found themselves vulnerable, outflanked, and unable to defend their positions. German officers, already stretched thin across multiple fronts, found themselves scrambling to adjust their plans on the fly. They had no countermeasure for this unexpected tactic. On the Allied side, the success of the amphibious river crossings was both a morale booster and a symbol of the changing tide of the war. The soldiers who had witnessed the crossings firsthand could hardly believe the efficiency with which the tanks navigated the rivers. The DD Sherman tanks proved that innovation, not just brute force, would win the war. The sight of these tanks crossing the river was a moment of collective triumph for the Allies, a reminder that they had the ingenuity to overcome the challenges of the battlefield. For the commanders, the use of the DD Sherman tank marked a turning point in military strategy. The Allies had not only achieved a major tactical victory, they had also sent a message to the Germans that they could no longer rely on their conventional strategies. The appearance of the tanks in the rivers, where the Germans had considered themselves invulnerable, demonstrated that the war was evolving in ways the Germans could not keep up with. The Allies, led by figures like General George Patton, understood that the key to success lay not just in overwhelming force, but in the ability to adapt, to surprise, and to exploit weaknesses in the enemy's strategy. The impact of this success was felt not just on the battlefield, but also in the broader strategic sense. The Allies now had the ability to cross rivers at will, bypassing traditional bottlenecks and defensive positions. This allowed them to move swiftly and decisively. pushing deeper into German territory with minimal delay. German defenses were now in disarray. As the Allies continued to advance, they were able to seize key positions along the rivers, cutting off German supply lines and preventing the enemy from mounting an effective counteroffensive. In the larger scope of the war, the deployment of the DD Sherman tanks was part of a broader trend of technological innovation and adaptation that ultimately tipped the scales in favor of the Allies. The tanks were a tangible demonstration of how technological superiority, when combined with bold leadership and tactical innovation, could overcome even the most entrenched defenses. The Allies had proven that they could not only outfight their enemy, but outthink them as well. However, while the Allies reaped the rewards of this tactical success, the psychological toll on the German soldiers was immense. The sight of the amphibious tanks crossing the river was a devastating blow to their morale. The Germans had invested so much in their river defenses, believing them to be impenetrable. Now, they were forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that their strategic thinking had been flawed. The loss of the river defenses was symbolic of a much deeper loss, a recognition that the war was slipping from their grasp, and that no matter how hard they fought, they could not stop the Allied advance. In the days that followed, the psychological effect rippled through the ranks of the German military. Soldiers who had once fought with the belief that they were defending the borders of the Reich now found themselves questioning the very foundations of their strategy. The appearance of the DD Sherman tanks at river crossings, once thought to be impassable, signaled the beginning of the end. The war was no longer about which side could hold the most territory. It was about which side could adapt and innovate faster. And the Allies, with their willingness to think outside the box, had shown that they were the ones capable of doing so. But while the technological breakthrough of the DD Sherman tank had a lasting impact on the battlefield, it also signaled a shift in the nature of warfare itself. The ability to adapt to new challenges, to use innovation to bypass traditional military thinking, would become a hallmark of modern warfare. The Allies had proven that war was not just about brute strength. It was about adaptability, surprise, and the ability to leverage every available advantage. No matter how unconventional it might seem, the tactical success of the river crossings, though significant in the moment, was only a part of a larger picture. As the Allies continued to press forward, they were not just winning battles, they were redefining the future of warfare. The Allies were not only taking advantage of the Germans' weaknesses, but they were also setting the stage for the kinds of innovations that would shape military strategies for decades to come. The story of the DD Sherman tank was just one chapter in a much larger tale of how innovation and adaptability would forever change the way wars were fought. 3E, story of the amphibious Sherman tank's role in crossing rivers during the final months of World War II is not merely about military strategy or technological innovation. It is about the nature of war itself and how ingenuity and adaptation can change the course of history. In the heat of battle, where everything is uncertain and every decision can be the difference between life and death, the ability to adapt quickly is often as crucial as the weapon in hand. The DD Sherman tank, with its ability to cross rivers without the need for bridges, became a symbol of the Allies' relentless drive to overcome obstacles, both physical and mental, that stood in their way. This moment in history is a testament to the spirit of innovation. The technology behind the DD Sherman tank, though flawed and experimental, reflected the best qualities of military engineers and planners who refused to accept the limitations of conventional warfare. It was not just about crossing a river. It was about breaking free from the constraints of traditional thinking, using creativity and resourcefulness to overcome what once seemed impossible. On a deeper level, the use of the DD Sherman tank is a reminder of how technology reshapes the course of war. The Germans, who had long believed their river defenses were insurmountable, were forced to confront the realization that war was evolving beyond their expectations. The Allies had introduced a new element, one that blurred the lines between what was possible and impossible, reminding the world that the outcome of wars is often determined not just by weapons and armies, but by the capacity to innovate in the face of adversity. For the soldiers, both American and German, the emotional impact of these crossings ran deep. For the Germans, it was the crushing blow to their confidence in their defense systems. Rivers, once their safeguard, became symbols of their vulnerability. For the Americans, it was a defining moment of their ingenuity, proof that even in the darkest of times, solutions could be found that changed the tide of battle. The success of the D.D. Sherman tank was a reflection of the larger shift in the war itself. The Allies, who had faced so many hardships, were now making decisive strides toward victory, armed not just with superior firepower, but with the knowledge that they had the ability to outthink their enemy. The river that once divided them from victory was no longer a barrier. It had become a passage. The path forward was clear. In the grand scope of history, this event serves as a reminder of how far military technology can evolve in short spans of time, and how those innovations can alter the outcome of wars. The D.D. Sherman tank did not just cross rivers, it crossed the threshold into a new era of warfare, one where adaptability, creativity, and technological advancements would continue to define the battlefield. As the war in Europe came to its inevitable conclusion in 1945, the lesson learned from the successful deployment of the D.D. Sherman tanks would live on. It was not merely about the crossing of a river, but about the recognition that war is not static. It is not about simply overpowering the enemy with sheer strength, but about overcoming challenges through unexpected means. The Shermans crossing those rivers in their moment of brilliance reshaped the Allied advance and reshaped the future of military strategy.